My brother Marcus stood behind his mahogany desk, barely containing his laughter as he gestured toward the newspaper article spread across his workspace. The headline read, "Tech Startup Collapses After 6 Months," and my company's logo was prominently displayed beneath it. He looked up at me with that familiar smirk I'd endured since childhood, the one that said he'd always known better. "Well, well, well, Sophie. Looks like your little experiment is finally over. Maybe now you can get serious about a real career." 20 minutes later, I was sliding acquisition documents across that same desk, watching the color drain from his face as he realized I now owned controlling shares in Davidson Industries, the company he'd spent the last decade climbing to the top of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The corner office on the 42nd floor of the Davidson Industries tower had always been Marcus's sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Chicago, while awards and accolades lined the walls, each one a testament to his rapid ascension through the company ranks. The space reeked of expensive leather and success, carefully curated to intimidate visitors and reinforce his position as Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. I had visited this office countless times over the years, usually summoned for what Marcus called reality checks, whenever my entrepreneurial ventures didn't meet his standards of conventional success. Today felt different, though I couldn't yet articulate why. Perhaps it was the unusual calm that had settled over me during the elevator ride up, or the way I'd noticed the subtle tension in the receptionist's smile when she announced my arrival. Marcus leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the newspaper article still spread before him like evidence in a trial. His perfectly tailored navy suit and platinum cufflinks caught the afternoon sunlight, creating an image of corporate authority that he'd cultivated with meticulous care. At 35, he was 3 years older than me, but he'd always acted as though the gap was decades rather than years. "I have to admit, Sophie, I'm almost impressed by how spectacular this failure was," he continued, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. 6 months from launch to bankruptcy. That might be some kind of record even for you." I remained standing near the door, my hands clasped behind my back, observing his performance with the detached interest of someone watching a predictable movie. Marcus had always needed an audience for his superiority, and I had long ago stopped providing the emotional reactions he craved. "The article is quite thorough," I replied evenly. "Did you read the whole thing, or just the headline?" He waved dismissively. "I read enough. Another one of your revolutionary ideas that the market just wasn't ready for. Same story, different year." Marcus picked up the paper, scanning it with exaggerated attention. "Let's see. Next Gen Solutions, founded by Sophie Chen, officially. Ceased operations this week after burning through initial funding. Pretty straightforward." The irony of his selective reading wasn't lost on me. Marcus had always been skilled at absorbing only the information that confirmed his existing beliefs while filtering out anything that might challenge his narrative. It was a trait that had served him well in corporate politics, but poorly in actual strategic thinking. "You know what this means, don't you?" he continued, setting the paper aside and fixing me with what he probably thought was a compassionate expression. "It's time to stop playing entrepreneur and join the real world. Davidson Industries is always looking for talented people, even if they need some guidance on practical business applications." The offer was delivered with his characteristic blend of condescension and supposed generosity. Marcus genuinely believed he was being magnanimous, offering to rescue his foolish little sister from her own poor judgment. He had no idea that his rescue was exactly what I'd been maneuvering toward for the past 18 months. "That's very thoughtful of you, Marcus," I said, my tone giving nothing away. "But I'm curious about something. How familiar are you with Davidson Industries' current ownership structure?" His brow furrowed slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. What do you mean? The company is publicly traded, obviously. The founding Davidson family still holds significant shares, but there's a diverse investor base. Diverse indeed. I agreed. And what about recent changes in that investor base? Any significant movements in the past few months? Marcus's expression shifted from confusion to mild irritation. He didn't appreciate having his knowledge questioned, especially about the company where he held such a prominent position. Sophie, I don't have time for whatever point you're trying to make. If you want career advice, I'm happy to help. If you want to play guessing games, I have actual work to do. I smiled then, the first genuine emotion I'd allowed myself since entering his office. Oh, I think you'll find this relevant to your work, Marcus. Very relevant indeed. From my briefcase, I withdrew a leather portfolio and approached his desk. Marcus watched with growing unease as I opened it and began removing documents. The first was a formal notification from the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding significant ownership disclosure requirements. This might interest you, I said, sliding the document across his desk. It details the recent acquisition of a 23% stake in Davidson Industries by Meridian Capital Holdings. Marcus picked up the document, his eyes scanning the official letterhead and formal language. So, major acquisitions happen all the time. What does this have to do with anything? I placed a second document beside the first. This one shows Meridian Capital's subsequent acquisition of additional shares from 3 different institutional investors, bringing their total holdings to 37%. His movements became more deliberate as he examined the second document. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to understand why I was sharing this information and what it might mean for his position at the company. The third document I placed before him was a corporate registration filing, showing the complete ownership structure of Meridian Capital Holdings. Marcus's name wasn't on it, but mine was listed as the sole proprietor and decision-making authority. The silence that followed was profound. I watched as understanding slowly dawned on his face, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something approaching panic. He looked up at me, then back at the documents, then up at me again. "This is impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You just filed for bankruptcy. You don't have the capital for something like this." I took the seat across from his desk, finally allowing myself to relax into the leather cushions. "Marcus, you've always been so focused on the obvious that you miss the subtleties. Next-Gen Solutions didn't fail because it was a bad idea. It failed because it was designed to fail." The color continued to drain from his face as the implications began to register. Designed to fail? What are you talking about? "Let me walk you through it," I said, settling more comfortably into my chair. 18 months ago, I realized that Davidson Industries was vulnerable to acquisition. The stock price was undervalued due to some poorly received quarterly reports. Institutional investors were growing impatient with dividend returns, and the founding family was dealing with estate planning issues that might force them to liquidate portions of their holdings. Marcus leaned forward, his earlier smugness replaced by intense focus. "You've been planning this for 18 months? Longer, actually, but 18 months ago is when I started executing the plan. Step 1 was establishing credibility as a serious business operator, which Next-Gen Solutions provided. The company had real technology, real customers, and real revenue streams." I paused, letting him absorb this information before continuing. Step 2 was building relationships with key institutional investors who held Davidson Industries shares. It's remarkable how willing people are to discuss investment strategies when they think you're just another struggling entrepreneur looking for guidance. Marcus's hands gripped the edge of his desk. "The networking events? All those industry conferences you kept attending? I thought you were just playing dress-up, pretending to be a serious businesswoman." I was building a comprehensive understanding of Davidson Industries' investor landscape, while simultaneously identifying which shareholders might be motivated to sell under the right circumstances. I removed another document from my portfolio. This is a timeline showing the correlation between Next-Gen Solutions funding rounds and my private acquisitions of Davidson Industries shares through various shell companies and investment vehicles. The document detailed a complex web of financial transactions spanning more than a year. Each time Next-Gen Solutions had announced new funding or partnerships, I had used the legitimacy and connections those announcements provided to quietly acquire more Davidson Industries stock. The beauty of the plan, I continued, was that everyone, including you, saw exactly what they expected to see. A younger sister struggling with unrealistic business ambitions, failing to understand market dynamics, burning through investor money on impractical ideas. Marcus's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. But Next-Gen really did fail. The bankruptcy filing is public record. Next-Gen served its purpose perfectly. By the time it ceased operations, I had used the credibility and connections it provided to acquire sufficient Davidson Industries shares to establish Meridian Capital as a major stakeholder. The company's failure was simply the final step in a much larger strategy. I opened my briefcase again and withdrew a thick legal document bound in blue covers. This is the formal notification I'll be filing with the SEC this afternoon, disclosing Meridian Capital's 41% ownership stake in Davidson Industries. Marcus stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. 41%? But you just said 37. That was yesterday's number. This morning, I completed the acquisition of an additional 4% from the Williamson Trust, which needed immediate liquidity due to some unrelated legal settlements. I smiled at his stunned expression. I now control the largest single block of Davidson Industries shares, which gives me significant influence over corporate governance, strategic direction, and executive appointments. The implications of this revelation seemed to hit him all at once. Marcus was an employee of Davidson Industries, regardless of his senior title and substantial responsibilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If I controlled the company's direction, I essentially controlled his professional future. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why go to all this trouble? If you wanted to work in corporate finance, I could have helped you find opportunities. You didn't need to orchestrate some elaborate takeover. The question revealed everything about how Marcus had always seen me and our relationship. Even now, faced with irrefutable evidence of my strategic capabilities, he couldn't conceive that my motivations might extend beyond seeking his approval or assistance. This isn't about wanting to work in corporate finance, Marcus. This is about demonstrating that the little sister you've spent years patronizing and dismissing is more than capable of outmaneuvering you in your own domain. I stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Chicago skyline that Marcus had claimed as the symbol of his success. Do you remember when I graduated from Northwestern with my MBA? You told me that business school was fine for learning theory, but real success required practical experience that only came from working under established leaders. Marcus nodded slowly, probably remembering the conversation, but not understanding why I was bringing it up now. You offered to put in a good word for me with Davidson Industries' Human Resources Department. Entry-level analyst position, maybe in market research or customer relations. Something appropriate for someone with my limited experience. I turned back to face him, noting how small he looked behind his impressive desk. I spent 3 years in consulting before business school, Marcus. I had analyzed corporate structures, developed acquisition strategies, and managed complex financial transactions. But you saw only what you wanted to see. Your younger sister, who needed guidance and protection. Sophie, I was trying to help. You were trying to manage me. There's a difference. I returned to my seat, maintaining eye contact. Every time I started a new venture, you were there with explanations of why it wouldn't work. When I succeeded, despite your predictions, you attributed it to luck or favorable market conditions. When I failed, it confirmed your assessment of my limitations. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I never meant to discourage you. I just wanted you to be realistic about your prospects. Realistic according to whose standards? You assumed that because you had found success within an established corporate structure, that was the only valid path forward. It never occurred to you that someone might choose a different approach, or that they might be successful using methods you didn't understand. I opened the blue-bound document and found the section I was looking for. As of this afternoon, I will be the largest individual shareholder in Davidson Industries, with voting rights that exceed those of any other single entity, including the founding family members who still serve on the board of directors. The weight of this statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Marcus understood corporate governance well enough to recognize what this meant for the company's future direction and his own position within it. What happens now? He asked, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Now we implement some changes that Davidson Industries has needed for quite some time. The company has been too conservative in its strategic investments, too slow to adapt to technological disruptions, and too comfortable with maintaining status quo operations rather than pursuing growth opportunities. I flipped through several pages of the document, highlighting key sections for his review. These are preliminary recommendations for operational restructuring, strategic realignment, and executive performance evaluation. The board will be reviewing them at next week's emergency meeting. Marcus's face had gone pale. Executive performance evaluation? Every senior leadership position will be assessed based on demonstrated results, strategic vision, and alignment with the company's new direction. Performance will be the only criterion that matters going forward. The implicit threat was clear, though I didn't need to state it explicitly. Marcus's position as Senior Vice President of Strategic Development would be subject to the same evaluation as every other executive role. His family connection to me wouldn't provide any protection if his performance didn't meet the new standards I intended to establish. I've spent 10 years building my career at Davidson Industries, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. I've exceeded every performance metric, led successful product launches, and built strong relationships with key clients, all of which will be taken into account during the evaluation process, I assured him. Merit-based assessment means exactly that. Merit will be the determining factor. I closed the document and returned it to my briefcase. Marcus, I'm not interested in destroying your career out of spite or revenge, but I am interested in ensuring that Davidson Industries operates with maximum efficiency and strategic focus. If your contributions align with those objectives, you'll continue to thrive. If they don't, adjustments will be necessary. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the office door. Marcus's assistant peered in, her expression uncertain. Mr. Davidson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have a conference call with the Portland clients in 10 minutes. Should I reschedule? Marcus looked at me, then back at his assistant. No, Helen. Tell them I'll be a few minutes late, but I'll definitely join the call. After she departed, he turned back to me with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. How long have you been planning this specific conversation? Walking into my office like this? I smiled at the question. Since the day you told me that entrepreneurship was a young person's game and that I should consider more stable career options. That was about 2 years ago, during the lunch where you explained why my second startup was doomed to fail. But that company did fail, he protested. That company served its purpose, just like Next Gen Solutions. Each venture taught me something valuable about market dynamics, investor psychology, or operational management. More importantly, each one reinforced everyone's perception of me as someone who was trying hard but lacking the skills for sustained success. I stood to leave, gathering my materials with deliberate care. The greatest advantage in any strategic endeavor is being underestimated by your opponents. You've spent years helping me maintain that advantage, Marcus. In a way, I should thank you. Marcus remained seated, staring at the documents spread across his desk. What should I tell people? About this meeting? About what's happening with the company? Tell them whatever you think is appropriate. The formal announcements will come through proper channels within the next few days. Until then, I'd suggest focusing on the Portland call and your other immediate responsibilities. I paused at the door, turning back for one final observation. Marcus, you're actually quite good at your job when you focus on execution rather than trying to manage other people's ambitions. I hope you'll remember that during the evaluation process. As I walked through the executive floor toward the elevator, I could feel the curious glances of other employees. They had no idea what had just transpired in Marcus's office, but they could sense that something significant had shifted in the corporate landscape. The elevator ride down felt different from the one that had brought me up. The same Chicago skyline was visible through the glass walls, but my relationship to it had fundamentally changed. I was no longer Marcus's little sister seeking approval or guidance. I was the person who would be shaping Davidson Industries' future direction. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message from Sarah Martinez, my attorney, and the one person who had known about the acquisition strategy from its early stages. Board meeting confirmed for Thursday at 2 p.m. All documentation is prepared and filed. Congratulations, Sophie. The validation felt good, but it was secondary to the deeper satisfaction of having executed a complex plan with precision and patience. For years, I had endured Marcus's condescension and the assumption that my business ventures were amateur experiments rather than calculated steps toward a larger objective. As I walked through the lobby of Davidson Industries, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every failed startup, every networking event, every conversation with potential investors had been building toward this acquisition. The sister who had been dismissed as impractical and unrealistic had just demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that Marcus and his colleagues claimed to value above all else. The afternoon sunlight felt warm as I stepped onto the sidewalk, outside Davidson Industries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as news of the ownership change began circulating through business circles. There would be resistance from some board members, skepticism from industry analysts, and undoubtedly more attempts by Marcus to understand how his little sister had managed to outmaneuver him so completely. But today, walking away from the building, that would soon be operating under my strategic direction, I allowed myself to savor the moment when years of careful planning had finally come to fruition. The woman who had been laughed at for her failed business had just acquired controlling interest in a $100 million corporation. The game had changed, and I was no longer playing by Marcus's rules. The Davidson Industries boardroom had witnessed countless pivotal decisions throughout its 70-year history, but none quite like what was unfolding on this gray Thursday afternoon. 12 executives and board members sat around the polished granite table, their expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to barely concealed panic as they processed the documents I had just distributed. The room itself commanded respect, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan and walls lined with portraits of the company's founding fathers. Today, however, the traditional symbols of corporate authority felt almost quaint. Compared to the seismic shift in power that my presence represented, at the head of the table, Chairman Robert Davidson maintained his characteristic composure, though I could detect the tension in the way his fingers drummed silently against his leather portfolio. At 68, he had spent his entire career building and protecting the family legacy that bore his name. The revelation that an outsider now controlled the largest voting bloc in his company was clearly challenging every assumption he held about corporate governance. Ms. Chen, he began, his voice carrying the measured authority of decades in executive leadership, These documents indicate that Meridian Capital Holdings has acquired 41% of Davidson Industries stock over the past 18 months. This represents the largest single ownership position in the company's history. I nodded calmly from my seat halfway down the table, the same seat I had specifically requested rather than the more prominent position near the chairman that protocol might have suggested. Strategic positioning wasn't just about corporate ownership. It was about managing perceptions and maintaining the element of surprise that had served me so well throughout this process. That's correct, Mr. Davidson. The acquisition was completed systematically through multiple transactions designed to minimize market disruption while establishing a significant governance position. Marcus sat 3 seats to my left, his face still pale from our conversation 2 days earlier. Since our meeting in his office, he had clearly been struggling to process the reality that his younger sister now wielded more corporate influence than he had achieved in his entire decade-long career at Davidson Industries. Board member Patricia Williams, the former CEO of a competing logistics firm, leaned forward with the sharp focus that had made her a respected voice in corporate governance circles. Ms. Chen, acquisitions of this magnitude typically require disclosure at various ownership thresholds. How was such a substantial position accumulated without triggering earlier notification requirements? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of sophisticated understanding I had hoped to encounter from the Davidson Industries board. These weren't passive investors or ceremonial appointees, but experienced business leaders who understood the mechanics of corporate control. An excellent question, Ms. Williams. The acquisitions were structured through multiple entities and investment vehicles, each remaining below the 5% disclosure threshold that triggers immediate reporting requirements. Additionally, the timing of purchases was coordinated to occur during periods of normal trading volume, avoiding any pattern that might suggest coordinated accumulation. I opened my briefcase and withdrew a comprehensive timeline showing every transaction, every entity involved, and every regulatory filing that had been submitted in accordance with securities law. As you can see, all activities were conducted in full compliance with SEC regulations, though I acknowledge the cumulative effect was not immediately apparent to outside observers. Chief Financial Officer David Kim, who had joined the company just 2 years earlier from a prestigious Wall Street investment bank, studied the documentation with obvious professional interest. This level of strategic planning and execution is remarkable. The coordination required to maintain regulatory compliance while avoiding market detection suggests sophisticated financial expertise. His observation carried no hint of criticism, only recognition of the technical complexity involved in what I had accomplished. David's background made him uniquely qualified to appreciate the nuances of corporate acquisition strategy, and his acknowledgement felt like an important validation of my approach. Thank you, David. The plan required careful attention to regulatory requirements and market dynamics, but it was certainly achievable with proper planning and execution. The silence that followed my response was heavy with implications that each board member was processing at their own pace. Some were undoubtedly calculating how this ownership change might affect their own positions, while others were probably wondering what strategic direction I intended to pursue for the company. Marcus finally found his voice, though it carried none of his usual confidence. Sophie, I think what everyone is trying to understand is what you intend to do with this position. Are you planning to take an active role in company operations, or is this purely a financial investment? The question provided the perfect opening to outline the vision I had been developing throughout the acquisition process. I'm glad you asked Marcus. I didn't acquire this position to serve as a passive investor. Davidson Industries has tremendous potential that hasn't been fully realized under current strategic approaches. I stood and moved to the presentation screen at the far end of the room, connecting my laptop to display the comprehensive analysis I had prepared. Over the past 18 months, while executing the acquisition strategy, I also conducted an extensive evaluation of Davidson Industries' operations, market position, and growth opportunities. The first slide showed a comparison of Davidson Industries' performance metrics against industry benchmarks and direct competitors. The data revealed a company that was financially stable, but strategically stagnant, generating consistent returns, without pursuing the innovation necessary for long-term growth. As you can see, Davidson Industries has maintained steady profitability, but growth rates have lagged behind industry averages for the past 3 years. Market share has remained essentially flat, while competitors have expanded into emerging sectors and geographic markets. Board member James Peterson, who had served as Davidson Industries' chief operating officer before retiring to a board position, raised his hand. Sophie, these metrics reflect deliberate strategic choices. We've prioritized stability and consistent returns over aggressive expansion because our shareholders value predictable dividends and low-risk investments. His comment reflected exactly the kind of conservative thinking that had limited Davidson Industries' potential for years. I understand that perspective, James, and there's certainly value in maintaining financial stability. However, stability without growth is ultimately unsustainable in a dynamic market environment. The next slide displayed projected market trends in the logistics and supply chain management sectors where Davidson Industries had built its foundation. Industry analysis indicates that companies failing to adapt to technological disruptions and changing customer expectations face declining relevance over the next 5 to 10 years. Patricia Williams nodded thoughtfully as she reviewed the data. What specific changes are you proposing, Ms. Chen? Are we talking about incremental improvements or fundamental restructuring? Strategic evolution rather than revolutionary change, I replied, advancing to a slide that outlined my preliminary recommendations. Davidson Industries has strong foundational capabilities that can be leveraged more effectively with targeted investments and operational improvements. The presentation detailed opportunities in automation technology, data analytics, sustainable logistics solutions, and expanded service offerings that complemented existing strengths while positioning the company for future market demands. Each recommendation was supported by financial projections, implementation timelines, and risk assessments. These initiatives would require significant capital investment, observed David Kim, his CFO perspective immediately focusing on the financial implications. What's the projected return timeline and funding strategy? I had anticipated this question and prepared detailed financial models showing various funding scenarios. Initial capital requirements are estimated at $47 million over 18 months, funded through a combination of retained earnings, strategic debt financing, and potentially a targeted equity offering if expansion accelerates beyond initial projections. The room grew quiet as board members absorbed the scope of what I was proposing. This wasn't merely operational tweaking or incremental improvement, but a comprehensive strategic repositioning that would transform Davidson Industries from a traditional logistics provider into an integrated technology-enabled supply chain solutions company. Chairman Davidson finally spoke after several minutes of contemplation. Ms. Chen, your analysis is thorough, and your recommendations are well-reasoned. However, implementing changes of this magnitude requires board approval and extensive stakeholder consultation. What timeline are you envisioning for decision-making and implementation? The question touched on the delicate balance between my position as majority shareholder and the governance processes that protected other stakeholders' interests. While I could theoretically force certain decisions through voting control, building consensus would be far more effective for long-term success. I propose a 90-day evaluation period during which these recommendations can be thoroughly reviewed, refined, and adapted based on board input and management assessment. Implementation would begin gradually with pilot programs and proof of concept initiatives before scaling to full operational integration. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What about current management structure and personnel? Are you planning significant organizational changes? His question was obviously motivated by personal concerns about his own position. but it raised legitimate issues about organizational stability during transition. Personnel decisions will be based entirely on performance, capability, and alignment with strategic objectives. I have no interest in wholesale management changes, but I do expect adaptation to new operational requirements and performance standards. Patricia Williams leaned back in her chair, her expression suggesting careful consideration of multiple factors. Ms. Chen, your strategic vision is compelling, but implementing change of this scope requires strong operational leadership. Do you intend to take a direct management role, or would you prefer to work through existing executive structure? The question went to the heart of how I envisioned my relationship with Davidson Industries going forward. I plan to take an active role in strategic oversight and major decision-making, but day-to-day operations should remain with qualified management professionals. My background is in strategic planning and corporate development, not operational management. I paused, making eye contact with each board member to emphasize the importance of what I was about to say. However, I will expect regular reporting, measurable progress against established objectives, and accountability for results. The era of comfortable status quo operations is ending. David Kim raised his hand. What about executive compensation and performance incentives? Will there be changes to current structures? Compensation will be aligned with performance metrics tied to strategic objectives. Executives who contribute to successful transformation will be rewarded accordingly. Those who resist necessary changes or fail to meet performance standards will face appropriate consequences. The implicit message was clear. Marcus and other senior executives would need to demonstrate their value under new criteria, rather than relying on established relationships or past achievements. Performance would determine future opportunities, regardless of personal history or family connections. Board member Thomas Mitchell, who had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, finally spoke. Ms. Chen, you've clearly invested significant time and resources in this acquisition. What's your long-term vision for Davidson Industries? Are you building toward eventual sale, public offering, or sustained family ownership? The question revealed important insights about how board members were interpreting my motivations. My interest is in building sustainable long-term value rather than optimizing for quick returns. Davidson Industries has the potential to become a market leader in next-generation logistics solutions, but realizing that potential requires patient capital and strategic focus. I advanced to my final presentation slide, which showed projected company valuation under various strategic scenarios. Conservative estimates suggest that successful implementation of these initiatives could increase company value by 60 to 80% over 5 years, while positioning Davidson Industries as an acquisition target for larger technology companies or private equity firms seeking logistics market exposure. The financial projections generated immediate attention from every person in the room. Board members began calculating the implications for their own equity positions and the potential returns for all shareholders if the strategy succeeded. Chairman Davidson studied the projections carefully. These are attractive numbers, Ms. Chen, but they assume successful execution of a complex transformation strategy. What gives you confidence that Davidson Industries can achieve these results? 3 factors, I replied without hesitation. First, the company has strong foundational capabilities and market relationships that provide a solid platform for expansion. Second, the strategic initiatives I'm proposing build on existing strengths rather than requiring complete operational restructuring. Third, I'm committed to providing the leadership focus and capital investment necessary to ensure successful implementation. Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable as the discussion progressed, clearly recognizing that his role in any future organizational structure was far from guaranteed. Sophie, these plans would fundamentally change the company culture and operational approach that have made Davidson Industries successful for decades. His objection reflected the resistance to change that had kept Davidson Industries trapped in mediocrity, despite its potential for growth. Marcus, the approaches that made Davidson Industries successful in the past may not be sufficient for future success. Market conditions are evolving, customer expectations are rising, and competitive pressures are intensifying. I returned to my seat, maintaining eye contact with him across the table. The choice isn't between change and stability. The choice is between proactive evolution and reactive decline. Companies that fail to adapt to changing market conditions don't maintain stability. They gradually lose relevance until they become acquisition targets or bankruptcy candidates. Patricia Williams nodded approvingly. Ms. Chen raises valid points about market dynamics. The logistics industry has seen significant disruption over the past 5 years, and companies that have adapted successfully have substantially outperformed those that maintain traditional approaches. Her support felt significant, both because of her industry expertise and her influence with other board members. Patricia's endorsement could help build the consensus necessary for implementing strategic changes without protracted resistance. David Kim consulted his notes before speaking. From a financial perspective, the strategic initiatives Ms. Chen is proposing appear to offer favorable risk-adjusted returns compared to maintaining current operations. The capital requirements are substantial but manageable within our existing financial capacity. Another important endorsement from a key board member whose opinion would carry weight with investors and other stakeholders. David's CFO background gave him credibility on financial matters that would be difficult for opponents to challenge. Chairman Davidson looked around the table, gauging the mood of other board members before responding. Ms. Chen, your presentation has been thorough and persuasive. I think I speak for the entire board when I say we appreciate the strategic vision you've outlined and the detailed analysis supporting your recommendations. He paused, choosing his words carefully. However, decisions of this magnitude require careful deliberation and extensive due diligence. I propose that we establish a special committee to evaluate these proposals in detail and report back to the full board within 60 days. The suggestion was reasonable from a governance perspective, but it also represented potential delay that could undermine implementation momentum. I appreciate the need for thorough evaluation, Mr. Davidson. However, I would suggest that 60 days might be too long given current market conditions and competitive pressures. I stood again, moving to the presentation screen to display a timeline showing key industry developments and competitor activities. Several of our primary competitors are implementing similar strategic initiatives right now. Delaying our response by 2 months could put us at a significant disadvantage in pursuing market opportunities. The timeline showed a clear pattern of industry consolidation and technological adoption that supported my argument for urgency. Companies that had moved quickly to embrace new business models were gaining market share, while those that had delayed were losing ground to more agile competitors. Board member James Peterson frowned as he studied the timeline. Sophie, rushing into major strategic changes without proper evaluation could be more damaging than missing short-term opportunities. We have a responsibility to all shareholders to ensure that any transformation strategy is thoroughly vetted. His concern was legitimate, but it also reflected the risk-averse mindset that had limited Davidson Industries' growth potential for years. I agree completely about the need for thorough evaluation, James. That's why I've spent 18 months developing this strategy while simultaneously acquiring the ownership position necessary to implement it. I returned to my briefcase and withdrew another document. This is a comprehensive due diligence report prepared by Brennan Associates, one of the leading strategic consulting firms in the Midwest. They conducted an independent evaluation of Davidson Industries' market position and the strategic recommendations I'm proposing. The Brennan Associates report provided third-party validation for my strategic analysis and recommendations. Their reputation in the consulting industry would make it difficult for board members to dismiss the proposals as uninformed or overly optimistic. Patricia Williams accepted the report and began scanning its executive summary. Brennan Associates has an excellent reputation for strategic analysis. What were their primary conclusions? They confirmed that Davidson Industries is well-positioned for the transformation I'm proposing, and that the financial projections are conservative relative to market opportunities. They also identified additional strategic options that could accelerate growth beyond my initial recommendations. The consulting report shifted the discussion from whether my strategic vision was viable to how quickly it could be implemented. Board members were now evaluating execution strategies rather than questioning fundamental assumptions. Marcus made one final attempt to slow the momentum building behind my proposals. Even if the strategy is sound, implementing it successfully requires management expertise that might not exist within our current organization. Shouldn't we consider hiring external consultants or interim executives to oversee the transformation? His suggestion revealed both his continued resistance to change and his implicit acknowledgement that he might not possess the capabilities necessary for leading strategic transformation. That's an interesting point, Marcus. Management capability is certainly crucial for successful implementation. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. However, I believe Davidson Industries has more internal capability than has been fully utilized under current organizational structures. Sometimes transformation requires empowering existing talent rather than importing external expertise. The comment was directed specifically at Marcus, but it also applied more broadly to the conservative management culture that had prevented Davidson Industries from realizing its potential. Many employees had probably developed ideas and insights that had never been seriously considered under the existing hierarchy. Chairman Davidson consulted his watch, noting that the meeting had already extended well beyond its scheduled duration. Ms. Chen, thank you for a comprehensive presentation of your strategic vision for Davidson Industries. I think it's clear that these proposals deserve serious consideration from the entire board. He looked around the table to gauge agreement from other members. I propose that we schedule a follow-up meeting in 3 weeks to continue this discussion after board members have had time to review the materials in detail. In the meantime, Ms. Chen, would you be available for individual consultations if board members have specific questions about your recommendations? The suggestion was reasonable and would provide opportunities for me to build individual relationships with board members who might have concerns about supporting major strategic changes. Absolutely, Mr. Davidson. I'm committed to ensuring that every board member has complete information about the proposed strategy before any final decisions are made. As the meeting concluded and board members began gathering their materials, I noticed several of them approaching David Kim and Patricia Williams for sidebar conversations. The body language suggested they were seeking additional perspectives on the strategic proposals rather than organizing resistance. Marcus remained, seated as other attendees filed out of the boardroom, clearly processing everything that had transpired during the past 2 hours. When we were finally alone, he looked at me with an expression that mixed admiration with bewilderment. Sophie, I have to ask, was any of this personal? Getting back at me for all the times I questioned your business judgment? The question revealed that he still didn't fully understand my motivations or the scope of what I had accomplished. Marcus, this was never about you. It was about proving to myself that I could execute a strategy of this complexity and scale. Your skepticism was just background noise. I gathered my materials, preparing to leave him alone with his thoughts. If it makes you feel better, your doubt actually helped me maintain the element of surprise that made this acquisition possible. Everyone, including you, saw exactly what they expected to see. As I walked toward the boardroom exit, Marcus called after me. What happens now? To me, I mean. What happens to my position at the company? I paused at the door, considering how to respond to his obvious anxiety about his professional future. That depends entirely on how well you adapt to new strategic priorities and performance expectations. Your decade of experience at Davidson Industries is valuable, but only if you can apply it effectively under changed circumstances. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave me time to reflect on what had just occurred in the boardroom. For months, I had anticipated this moment when my strategic vision would finally be presented to the people responsible for Davidson Industries governance. The reception had been better than I had hoped, with several board members showing genuine interest in the transformation strategy. More importantly, the discussion had shifted from whether change was necessary to how quickly it could be implemented. That represented a fundamental victory in establishing the legitimacy of my position and the viability of my strategic recommendations. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Martinez. "How did the board meeting go? Are you still the majority shareholder, or did they somehow find a way to challenge your position?" I smiled at her humor while typing a response. Better than expected. Several board members seemed genuinely interested in the strategic vision. Follow-up meeting. Scheduled in 3 weeks to continue the discussion. Sarah's response came immediately. "Excellent. I'll start preparing the detailed implementation documentation in case they decide to move forward quickly. Congratulations on clearing another major hurdle." As I drove through downtown Chicago toward my apartment, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with Davidson Industries had changed over the past few days. A week ago, I had been Marcus's little sister who kept failing at business ventures. Today, I was the majority shareholder presenting strategic vision to the company's board of directors. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, though it might have seemed that way to outside observers. Every step had been carefully planned and methodically executed, from the initial market analysis that identified Davidson Industries as an acquisition target through the complex financial maneuvering that established my controlling position. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as news of the ownership change began circulating through industry networks. There would undoubtedly be questions from business journalists, speculation from competitors, and curiosity from potential partners about what direction Davidson Industries would pursue under new strategic leadership. But tonight, driving through the city where I had spent years building the expertise and relationships necessary for this acquisition, I allowed myself to savor the satisfaction of having executed a plan that most people would have considered impossible. The woman who had been dismissed as an impractical dreamer had just presented a strategic vision that could transform a traditional logistics company into an industry leader. The hardest part was over. Now came the even more challenging task of implementation. 3 weeks later, I stood in the same Davidson Industries boardroom, but everything had changed. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across a table now covered with implementation documents, financial projections, and strategic roadmaps that would reshape the company's future. The board members who had listened with polite skepticism during my initial presentation now leaned forward with genuine engagement. Their questions focused on execution details rather than fundamental viability. Chairman Robert Davidson called the meeting to order with uncharacteristic energy in his voice. The past 21 days had been transformative for everyone involved, as board members conducted their own due diligence and discovered that my strategic recommendations weren't just visionary thinking, but practical solutions to problems they had been struggling with for years. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we've had 3 weeks to evaluate Ms. Chen's strategic proposals in detail. I've spoken individually with each of you, and I believe we're ready to move forward with formal consideration of her transformation plan for Davidson Industries." Patricia Williams nodded approvingly from her position near the head of the table. During our private consultation the previous week, she had revealed that her own analysis of industry trends supported everything I had proposed, and that several competitors were already implementing similar strategies with measurable success. "Before we begin formal voting on specific initiatives," Patricia said, "I want to acknowledge that Ms. Chen's analysis has identified opportunities that our traditional strategic planning process had missed. Her outside perspective, combined with insider knowledge of our operations, has produced insights that frankly should have occurred to us years ago." The admission carried weight coming from someone with Patricia's reputation for rigorous analysis and conservative judgment. Her endorsement had influenced other board members who might have been inclined toward skepticism about rapid strategic change. David Kim opened his laptop and connected to the presentation screen. I've prepared a comprehensive financial analysis of the proposed initiatives, including revised projections based on additional market research we conducted over the past 3 weeks. His presentation showed that the financial models I had originally provided were actually conservative compared to what detailed analysis suggested was achievable. Market demand for the services Davidson Industries could provide under the new strategic direction exceeded even my optimistic estimates. The capital requirements remain substantial, David continued, but the projected returns are compelling enough to justify the investment risk. Additionally, we've identified several financing options that would minimize dilution to existing shareholders while providing sufficient funding for full implementation. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable, but his body language suggesting resignation to changes he could no longer influence or control. During the 3-week evaluation period, he had made several attempts to build opposition to my proposals among other executives, but his efforts had been undermined by the evident strength of the strategic analysis. More significantly, his resistance had highlighted exactly the kind of change-averse thinking that had limited Davidson Industries' growth potential. Other executives who had initially been sympathetic to his concerns began distancing themselves as they recognized the career implications of opposing clearly superior strategic direction. Board member James Peterson, who had been the most vocal advocate for caution during the initial presentation, now spoke with grudging acceptance of the inevitable. Ms. Chen, I want to acknowledge that your strategic vision has proven more thoroughly developed than I initially understood. The implementation timeline you've proposed appears both ambitious and achievable. His shift in perspective reflected broader changes in boardroom dynamics over the past 3 weeks. As each member conducted independent analysis of my recommendations, the compelling nature of the strategic opportunity became impossible to ignore. Thomas Mitchell raised his hand to address the room. I've been conducting informal discussions with several key clients about their evolving needs and expectations. Without revealing our specific strategic considerations, I can confirm that demand for the enhanced services Ms. Chen is proposing significantly exceeds our current capacity to provide them. The client feedback provided crucial validation that my market analysis accurately reflected real customer demand rather than theoretical opportunities. Companies throughout the region were actively seeking exactly the kinds of integrated logistics solutions that Davidson Industries could provide under the new strategic direction. What about implementation risks? Asked board member Linda Chen, no relation despite the shared surname. We're discussing fundamental changes to operations that have been successful for decades. What safeguards exist if market response doesn't meet projections? Her question demonstrated the kind of risk assessment that responsible governance required, but it also provided an opportunity to outline the careful planning that had gone into every aspect of the strategic transformation. Excellent question, Linda. The implementation plan includes multiple checkpoints where we can evaluate progress and adjust strategy based on real market feedback. Additionally, the phased rollout approach means we can validate assumptions with pilot programs before committing full resources to any specific initiative. I stood and moved to the presentation screen to display a detailed implementation timeline that showed how each strategic component would be introduced gradually, with clear metrics for measuring success and predefined criteria for expansion or modification. The beauty of this approach is that it builds on Davidson Industries' existing strengths while adding new capabilities incrementally. If any specific initiative doesn't perform as projected, we can adjust or discontinue it without compromising the overall strategic direction. Chairman Davidson studied the timeline carefully. Ms. Chen, this phased approach addresses many of the concerns board members have raised about implementation risk. It appears you've thought through contingency planning as thoroughly as the primary strategy. His observation was accurate. though it only reflected the surface level of planning that had gone into developing the transformation strategy. Every aspect had been analyzed from multiple perspectives, with alternative scenarios developed for various market conditions and competitive responses. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying a note of defeat that hadn't been present 3 weeks earlier. Sophie, I need to ask directly, what role do you envision for current senior management during this transformation? Are you planning to bring in external leadership for implementation? The question everyone had been thinking, but nobody else had been willing to voice directly. Marcus's position as Senior Vice President of Strategic Development made him particularly vulnerable to organizational changes, since strategic development was exactly what I would be overseeing as majority shareholder. Marcus, management roles will be determined based on capability, performance, and alignment with new strategic objectives. I have no predetermined plans for wholesale personnel changes, but I do expect adaptation to evolved responsibilities and performance standards. I paused, making eye contact with him across the table. Your decade of experience at Davidson Industries is valuable, but only if you can apply it effectively to support strategic transformation rather than resist necessary changes. The implication was clear without being explicitly threatening. Marcus and other senior executives would need to demonstrate their value under new criteria, rather than relying on established relationships or historical performance that might not be relevant to future requirements. Patricia Williams leaned forward with obvious interest in the organizational dynamics. Ms. Chen, you've outlined an impressive strategic vision, but implementing change of this scope requires strong operational leadership. How do you plan to balance strategic oversight with day-to-day management responsibilities? The question touched on one of the most critical aspects of successful transformation. I intend to maintain active involvement in strategic direction and major decision-making, but operational management should remain with qualified professionals who understand the business intimately. I returned to my seat, maintaining eye contact with board members as I continued. However, I will expect regular reporting, measurable progress against established objectives, and accountability for results. The era of comfortable status quo, operations is ending, regardless of who occupies specific management positions. David Kim consulted his notes before speaking. From a governance perspective, how do you envision the relationship between your role as majority shareholder and the board's oversight responsibilities? There's potential for conflict if strategic decisions don't align with traditional board authority. His question demonstrated sophisticated understanding of corporate governance complexities that could arise when ownership concentration reached the levels I now controlled. An excellent point, David. My intention is to work collaboratively with the board while exercising the rights and responsibilities that come with majority ownership. I opened my briefcase and withdrew a document I had been preparing specifically for this discussion. This is a proposed governance framework that clarifies decision-making authority for various types of strategic and operational matters. It's designed to provide certainty for all stakeholders while maintaining appropriate checks and balances. The governance framework outlined which decisions required board approval, which fell under majority shareholder authority, and which could be delegated to management teams. It was comprehensive enough to prevent most conflicts, while flexible enough to allow for efficient decision-making. Chairman Davidson accepted the document and began reviewing its contents. This is thoughtful approach to what could otherwise become contentious governance issues. Have you consulted with legal counsel about the enforceability and practical implications? Yes, the framework was developed in consultation with Adams and Blackwell, the same firm that handled the acquisition structure. They've confirmed that all provisions comply with corporate law requirements while providing clear operational guidance. The mention of Adams and Blackwell carried additional weight, since their reputation for sophisticated corporate transactions was well established among Chicago business circles. Their involvement suggested that every aspect of my planning had been professionally validated. Thomas Mitchell raised his hand with another practical question. Ms. Chen, implementing these strategic changes will require significant communication with employees, customers, and industry partners. What's your approach to managing external perceptions during the transformation? The question highlighted another crucial aspect of successful implementation that could determine whether strategic changes were accepted or resisted by key stakeholders. Communication strategy is essential for maintaining confidence during transition periods. I've developed a comprehensive plan for engaging with each stakeholder group. I connected my laptop to the presentation screen and displayed a detailed communication timeline showing how information would be shared with employees, customers, suppliers, and industry partners at appropriate stages of implementation. The key principle is transparency about strategic direction while maintaining confidentiality about competitive details that could benefit our rivals. Stakeholders will understand what changes are happening and why they're necessary, but specific operational details will be protected. Patricia Williams nodded approvingly as she reviewed the communication plan. This level of detail suggests you've anticipated most of the practical challenges that arise during major organizational transitions. Have you considered hiring external communications consultants to support implementation? I've identified several potential partners, but my preference is to handle initial communications internally to maintain message consistency and strategic control. External support can be added if needed as implementation scales up. The discussion continued for another hour as board members raised detailed questions about every aspect of the transformation strategy. Their inquiries demonstrated genuine engagement with the proposals rather than skeptical resistance, and their suggestions often enhanced rather than challenged the strategic framework. Finally, Chairman Davidson called for formal consideration of the strategic recommendations. Ms. Chen, you've presented a compelling case for transforming Davidson Industries' strategic direction. The board has had adequate time to evaluate your proposals, and I believe we're ready for formal voting on implementation. The moment I had been building toward for 18 months had finally arrived. Everything I had accomplished during the acquisition process had been leading to this decision point where Davidson Industries would either embrace strategic transformation or continue gradual decline under outdated approaches. Before we proceed with voting, I said, standing to address the room one final time, I want to emphasize that this transformation represents an opportunity rather than a disruption. Davidson Industries has the foundation to become an industry leader, but realizing that potential requires the courage to evolve beyond comfortable familiar patterns. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. The strategic vision I'm proposing builds on 70 years of operational excellence while positioning the company for sustained success in a rapidly changing market environment. This isn't about abandoning what has made Davidson Industries successful. It's about ensuring that success continues for the next 70 years. Chairman Davidson called for the vote on Resolution 2024-07, formally approving the Strategic Transformation Plan and authorizing implementation to begin immediately. The voting was conducted by written ballot to ensure confidentiality and prevent any member from feeling pressured by peer influence. As ballots were collected and counted, the room fell silent, except for the soft sounds of traffic from the street below and the distant hum of air conditioning. These few minutes would determine whether months of planning and strategic maneuvering would result in the transformation I envisioned or require alternative approaches that might take years to achieve. David Kim, serving as vote tabulator, cleared his throat before announcing the results. Resolution 2024-07 passes by a vote of 8 in favor, 3 opposed, and 1 abstention. The Strategic Transformation Plan is formally approved for implementation. The announcement triggered immediate activity as board members began discussing implementation timelines, resource allocation, and communication strategies. The decision represented not just approval of my strategic recommendations, but validation of the entire acquisition strategy that had brought me to this position. Marcus remained seated as other board members stood to congratulate me on the successful vote. His expression suggested he was still processing the reality that his younger sister had not only acquired control of Davidson Industries, but had now secured board approval for fundamentally changing how the company operated. Patricia Williams approached with obvious satisfaction about the outcome. Sophie, congratulations on developing and presenting such a comprehensive strategic vision. I'm genuinely excited about Davidson Industries' potential under this new direction. Her endorsement felt particularly meaningful given her initial skepticism about rapid organizational change. Patricia's evolution from cautious questioner to enthusiastic supporter demonstrated that the strategic recommendations could withstand rigorous analysis from experienced business leaders. David Kim joined our conversation with practical questions about implementation logistics. Sophie, what's your timeline for beginning the first phase of strategic initiatives? The financial projections assume certain implementation milestones, so timing will be crucial for meeting performance targets. I'd like to begin pilot programs within 60 days, I replied. The phased approach means we can start with initiatives that have the highest probability of success while building organizational confidence for more complex changes. Thomas Mitchell overheard our discussion and approached with additional insights. Sophie, I've been thinking about the client communication strategy. Several of our largest customers have been asking about enhanced service capabilities, so announcing these strategic developments could actually strengthen existing relationships. His observation provided important validation that market timing favored the transformation strategy. Customers were already seeking exactly the kinds of enhanced services that Davidson Industries would be able to provide under the new strategic direction. As the formal meeting concluded and board members began departing, Chairman Davidson asked me to remain for a brief private conversation. When the room had emptied except for the two of us, he moved to the window overlooking Lake Michigan and stood silently for several moments. Sophie, I want you to know that what you've accomplished over the past 18 months is remarkable, both strategically and operationally. Building the ownership position necessary to drive change while simultaneously developing a comprehensive transformation plan required capabilities that few people possess. His acknowledgement carried special weight given his decades of experience in corporate leadership and his initial resistance to rapid organizational change. Thank you, Mr. Davidson. I appreciate the board's willingness to evaluate the strategic recommendations objectively rather than dismissing them because of how I acquired my position. He turned from the window to face me directly. The acquisition strategy was brilliant, but the strategic vision is what convinced the board to support implementation. You've demonstrated that success in business requires both tactical execution and strategic thinking. Robert paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm curious about your long-term intentions for Davidson Industries. The strategic plan outlines 5-year objectives, but what's your personal vision for the company beyond that time frame? The question touched on something I had been considering throughout the acquisition process, but hadn't fully articulated, even to myself. Honestly, Mr. Davidson, my focus has been on proving that the strategic transformation is viable and beneficial for all stakeholders. Long-term plans will depend on how successfully we execute the immediate initiatives. He nodded thoughtfully. That's a mature perspective. Too many people in your position would already be planning exit strategies or acquisition scenarios rather than focusing on operational success. As I gathered my materials to leave, Robert offered one final observation. Sophie, your brother, Marcus is struggling with these changes more than he's willing to admit publicly. He's a capable executive, but his identity has been closely tied to his position at Davidson Industries. You might consider whether there's a way to help him find a productive role in the transformed organization. The suggestion revealed Robert's concern for longtime employees during periods of organizational change, but it also highlighted the personal complexities that would need to be managed alongside strategic implementation. I appreciate that perspective, I replied. Marcus's experience is valuable, but his effectiveness will depend on his willingness to adapt to new performance standards and strategic priorities. I can't create opportunities for him, but I won't prevent him from earning them either. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave me time to process everything that had occurred during the past few hours. The board vote represented the culmination of 18 months of strategic planning and execution, but it also marked the beginning of an even more challenging phase focused on operational implementation. My phone buzzed with several text messages that had accumulated during the meeting. Sarah Martinez had sent congratulations along with reminders about legal documentation that would need to be filed following the board's approval. Business journalist had requested interviews about the strategic changes at Davidson Industries. A supplier I had been cultivating sent an inquiry about expanded partnership opportunities. The external interest confirmed that news of Davidson Industries' transformation was already circulating through industry networks. Managing that attention while maintaining competitive advantage would require careful communication strategies and selective disclosure of operational details. As I drove through downtown Chicago toward my apartment, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with both Marcus and Davidson Industries had evolved over the past month. 4 weeks ago, I had been his younger sister whose business ventures provided entertainment and occasional concern. Today, I was the majority shareholder implementing strategic changes that would reshape the company's future. The transformation hadn't occurred overnight, despite how it might have appeared to outside observers. Every component had been carefully planned and methodically executed, from identifying Davidson Industries as an acquisition target through building the relationships necessary for successful strategic implementation. More importantly, the process had revealed capabilities I hadn't fully recognized in myself. The strategic thinking, financial analysis, and organizational leadership required for this acquisition had always been present, but they had been overshadowed by Marcus's assumptions about my limitations and my own willingness to accept those constraints. The evening news was already reporting on Davidson Industries' announced strategic transformation, though the coverage focused on corporate developments rather than the personal dynamics behind the ownership change. Business analysts were generally positive about the company's new direction, with several noting that the logistics industry was overdue for the kind of innovation Davidson Industries was planning to implement. My phone rang as I was preparing dinner, and Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID. I hesitated before answering, uncertain whether he was calling to congratulate me on the board's decision or to continue expressing resistance to changes he couldn't prevent. Sophie. His voice was subdued but not hostile. I wanted to call and acknowledge what you accomplished today. The board vote was decisive, and it's clear that your strategic vision has strong support from people whose judgment I respect. The admission represented a significant shift from his attitude just weeks earlier, when he had dismissed my business capabilities and assumed that Davidson Industries would never embrace dramatic organizational change. Thank you, Marcus. I know this hasn't been easy for you, watching someone you've always seen as your little sister acquire control of the company where you've built your career. There was a long pause before he responded. I've been thinking about that conversation we had in my office, when you revealed the acquisition. I keep trying to understand how I missed what you were doing for 18 months. The signs must have been there. His reflection revealed genuine puzzlement about how someone he thought he knew well had executed such a sophisticated strategy without detection. Marcus, you saw exactly what I wanted you to see. Everyone did. The greatest advantage in any strategic endeavor is being underestimated by the people around you. Another pause. Sophie, I need to ask about my position at the company. I know you said personnel decisions would be based on performance, but I'm wondering what that means practically. Should I be looking for opportunities elsewhere? The question was obviously difficult for him to ask, given both his pride and his genuine attachment to Davidson Industries. That depends entirely on you, Marcus. Your experience is valuable, but only if you can apply it to support strategic transformation rather than resist necessary changes. I moved to the window of my apartment, looking out at the Chicago skyline where Davidson Industries headquarters was visible in the distance. I'm not interested in punishing you for past skepticism, but I won't create artificial opportunities based on family relationships either. If you want to be part of Davidson Industries' future, you'll need to earn that position through performance and contribution. Marcus was quiet for several moments before responding. I think I understand. And Sophie, for what it's worth, I'm sorry for all the times I dismissed your business ideas or suggested you weren't ready for serious corporate responsibility. You've proven that my judgment was completely wrong. The apology was unexpected but appreciated, representing the first acknowledgement from Marcus that his assessments of my capabilities had been systematically inaccurate. I appreciate that, Marcus, but the important thing now is moving forward rather than relitigating past decisions. After we ended the call, I spent the evening reviewing implementation timelines and resource allocation plans that would guide Davidson Industries' transformation over the coming months. The strategic framework had been approved, but successful execution would require constant attention to operational details and performance metrics. The next morning brought immediate validation of the board's decision. David Kim called before 7 o'clock to report that 3 major clients had already contacted Davidson Industries expressing interest in expanded service arrangements based on preliminary information about the company's new strategic direction. Sophie, the market. Response is exceeding even your optimistic projections, he said, excitement evident in his voice. These clients have been asking for integrated logistics solutions for months, and news that we're developing those capabilities has generated immediate interest. The early client response confirmed that market timing strongly favored the transformation strategy. Companies throughout the region were actively seeking exactly the enhanced services that Davidson Industries would be able to provide under the new strategic direction. By mid-morning, my assistant had fielded interview requests from 4 business publications, 3 industry trade journals, and 2 local television stations. The level of media interest suggested that Davidson Industries' transformation was being viewed as a significant development in the regional business community. I agreed to one print interview with Chicago Business Weekly, primarily because their coverage reached the audience of potential clients and partners who would be most important for successful implementation. The interview would also provide an opportunity to shape public perception of the strategic changes rather than allowing others to control the narrative. The interview, conducted in my office at Davidson Industries, focused on strategic vision rather than personal dynamics or acquisition details. The journalist was primarily interested in how the transformation would position the company for future growth and what it meant for the broader logistics industry. Ms. Chen, your strategic plan for Davidson Industries represents a significant departure from traditional logistics services. What convinced you that the market was ready for this kind of integrated approach? The journalist asked. Market research consistently shows that customers are seeking comprehensive solutions rather than fragmented services from multiple providers. Davidson Industries has the operational foundation to meet that demand, but only if we evolve beyond traditional service models. The interview continued for 45 minutes, covering strategic objectives, implementation timelines, and competitive positioning. By focusing on business fundamentals rather than personal circumstances, I was able to establish credibility as a serious strategic thinker rather than someone who had stumbled into corporate control through fortunate circumstances. The article, published 3 days later, positioned Davidson Industries' transformation as an example of how established companies could successfully adapt to changing market conditions through strategic innovation rather than defensive cost-cutting. 2 weeks after the board vote, the first pilot programs were already showing measurable results. Client satisfaction scores had improved significantly for customers participating in enhanced service trials, and employee engagement surveys indicated growing enthusiasm for the company's new direction. Marcus had requested a meeting to discuss his role in the implementation process, and his approach was markedly different from our previous interactions. Instead of defending existing practices or questioning new initiatives, he presented specific ideas for applying his operational experience to support strategic transformation. Sophie, I've been analyzing the technology integration requirements for the enhanced logistics platform, he said, spreading detailed technical specifications across the conference table. Based on my experience with our current systems, I think we can accelerate implementation by 6 to 8 weeks if we modify the rollout sequence. His recommendations demonstrated both technical competence and genuine commitment to successful implementation rather than resistance to change. These are thoughtful suggestions, Marcus. Have you discussed them with the IT team to confirm feasibility? I've had preliminary conversations with David Chen, our Chief Technology Officer. He agrees that the modified approach could reduce integration complexity while maintaining system reliability. The conversation continued for an hour as Marcus outlined several operational improvements that could enhance implementation effectiveness. His insights reflected deep understanding of Davidson Industries' systems and processes, combined with strategic thinking that had been largely absent from his previous approach to organizational challenges. As we concluded the meeting, Marcus offered an observation that surprised me with its insight. Sophie, I think I'm finally understanding what you meant about being underestimated providing strategic advantage. I spent so much time focusing on your failures that I never really analyzed your successes or tried to understand what you were learning from each experience. The comment revealed a level of self-awareness that suggested Marcus might indeed be capable of adapting to the performance standards and strategic thinking required for success in the transformed organization. 6 months later, Davidson Industries had exceeded every performance metric established for the first phase of strategic implementation. Client satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, revenue growth was accelerating beyond projected timelines, and employee retention had improved significantly as people embraced opportunities to contribute to organizational transformation. Marcus had been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Operations, a new position created to oversee the integration of traditional services with enhanced capabilities. His operational expertise, combined with newfound appreciation for strategic innovation, had made him one of the most effective leaders in implementing the transformation. The industry recognition had been equally gratifying. Davidson Industries received the Midwest Business Innovation Award for Strategic Transformation, and I was invited to speak at several conferences about successful organizational change management. But the most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source. At the company's annual shareholders meeting, Chairman Robert Davidson announced that Davidson Industries' market valuation had increased by 43% since implementation of the strategic transformation began, exceeding even the most optimistic projections from my original business plan. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing the assembled shareholders, this transformation represents what's possible when visionary strategic thinking is combined with disciplined execution and organizational commitment to excellence. As I stood to address the shareholders about future strategic objectives, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years earlier, I had been Marcus's little sister whose business ventures provided entertainment and occasional concern. Today, I was the majority shareholder of a thriving company that was setting new standards for innovation in the logistics industry. The woman who had been laughed at for her failed business had built something far more substantial than anyone had imagined possible. But more importantly, I had proven to myself that the capabilities I always possessed were sufficient for achieving any objective I was willing to pursue with enough patience, planning, and strategic thinking. The game hadn't just changed. I had changed the rules entirely. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.